First, the principle that all humans have equal ability to judge true from false. Second, the idea that doubt is a path to certitude. Third, that dispute and probability are signs of a false system. So first, Descartes opens his work, Discourse on Method, with the following assertion, quote, "Good sense is the best distributed thing in the world. The power of judging well and distinguishing true from false is naturally equal in all men," end quote. Descartes' evidence for this is that we all naturally assume that we are excellent at determining true from false. Dr. Bolin must think he's good at determining true from false, as does Dr. Papadopoulos. And neither of them clearly are better at it than the other. He combines this idea with his second principle, which is the notion that doubt is a path to certitude, and that the proper end of our intellectual inquiry is certitude. Doubt is the path through which we test and refine all of our ideas about reality, discarding the weaker ones and replacing them only with those that appear clearly and distinctly in our minds. Finally, he asserts that dispute or mere probability is a sign of a false system. This is because he believes that the human mind, is made to achieve certitude. So if something is merely probable, it is actually an embarrassment to the true potential of our human minds. Along with this, he disregards any system that comes together by the work of many hands or is developed over time, which we will talk about that more in a minute. Descartes now proceeds to apply these principles in his method through a process of intellectual bushwhacking. The first potential source of knowledge that he prunes to make room for his method is the tradition of philosophy, the entire backbone of Western civilization. He does this because he holds these systems of philosophy to be too disputed, too contentious to be reliable sources of truth. Also, he believes that any system that is built by many hands, like I said earlier, or developed over time is too contentious and lacking in perfection. He says, quote, there is often not so much perfection in works composed in pieces and made by many hands. Thus, one sees that buildings undertaken and completed by a single architect are usually more attractive and better ordered, end quote. For Augustine, the pursuit to truth is not a communal enterprise. It's actually the endeavor of a single sovereign intellect, because in the systems built and orchestrated by a single mind, we can identify a clear ordering principle. At this point, Augustine decides that philosophical tradition cannot possibly contend with the clarity of one man's mind. He proceeds to entirely reject the idea that humans are social by nature, an idea put forth by his philosophical forebears, especially Aristotle. This is grounded in his initial principle that we are all capable of equal judgment. If we are all able to distinguish true from false, we hardly have any need for a guide to show us the true way. We do not need a philosopher to show us the way out of Plato's dark cave, or a Virgil to cultivate our knowledge and pilot us to the threshold of beatitude. In fact, any external input only clouds our judgment and adulterates our pure and autonomous act of the intellect. Like Kant, Descartes suggests that the enlightened man must be free from dependence. He thus withdraws into himself, leaving the entire world of humanity behind, and believes that this isolation is true human freedom. He says, quote, I little by little freed myself, resolving one day to study within myself and to spend all the powers of my mind in choosing the paths that I should follow. In this, I had much more success, end quote. Perhaps we can see where Descartes is going at this point. He has left tradition behind. He has left the entire human world behind. And now, in his intellectual isolation, he decides to leave the entire external world behind, deeming his own physical senses as illusory and untrustworthy sources of truth. With this, there is the adjacent notion that truth itself is not accessible to us through our composite nature, but is something that must be violently extracted from the obscurity of nature. In this isolation, Descartes is left to wonder, what am I? And the sole insight that presents itself to him is that he is thinking, and this act of thinking necessarily implies the existence of a thinker. This leads him to his famous realization, I think, therefore I am. But what are the real implications of this timeless phrase? Descartes' approach is one of intellectual isolationism. He believes that the mind must operate independently of tradition, of society, and of its own body. For him, independence of these things is the meaning of human freedom. Some of us may recognize this as a modern form of Gnosticism, which is essentially an understanding of the human person as dualistic, as yes, a mind and a body, but these two aspects of ourselves are like warring factions. They're in competition with each other and don't always meaningfully inform each other. For such a man, speculative philosophy is nothing more than the musings of an isolated intellect that has castrated itself, cut itself off from any meaningful manifestation in the external world. Descartes, in his philosophy, in these ideas, dooms himself and all humans to function as divided beings, suggesting that enlightenment comes from liberation from the external world. But as he ends his work, Discourse on Method, this idea of enlightenment seems to simply equate to power and dominion over nature. He ends with the following eerie statement, quote, "For these notions made me see that it is possible to arrive at knowledge that would be very useful in life, and that in place of the speculative philosophy taught in schools, it is possible to find a practical philosophy by means of which we might render ourselves, as it were, masters and possessors of nature." End quote. Now let's turn to St. Augustine, a man who in his own life almost embodied some of the Cartesian implications. He began with an idea of human nature as dualistic, but through his own conversion, he ultimately arrived at the idea that human nature is hylomorphic, a unity of body and soul. Like Descartes, Augustine is searching for truth, and his search begins in Carthage, where he is sent to pursue his studies and to train as an orator. It is also in Carthage that Augustine begins to explore his adolescent impulses and quickly falls into a very hedonistic and licentious lifestyle. He indulges himself in a carnal world, attending stage plays that are unrestrained in their depictions of violence and promiscuity. He surrounds himself with friends who praise depravity, and he engages in many sexual affairs. He says, quote, "I came to Carthage where a cauldron of illicit loves leapt and boiled about me." End quote. It is also at this time in his young life that Augustine is confronted with two opposing yet powerful influences. First, the influence of philosophy. Second, the influence of the Manichaean religion. Augustine encounters philosophy, love of immortal wisdom, through the works of Cicero. And it is at this time that a seed is planted in him, where he longs for real meaning and for a truth that goes beyond mere appearances. It is also at this time that he briefly explores sacred scripture, but is quickly off-put by it in its exhortations to become like little children, compared to the heroic ideals expressed by Cicero. Augustine says, quote, "I came upon something, sacred scripture, as not to be grasped by the proud, something humble in the hearing, but sublime in the doing, and shrouded in deep mystery. I was not of the nature yet to enter into it or bend my neck to follow it. End quote. Augustine's soul, impoverished by his sensual mode of living, is primed for a very different kind of philosophy, namely the doctrine of the Manichees, a religious group that taught that the world, the cosmos, is engaged in a dualistic struggle between the comparable power of light, goodness, and evil, darkness. Part of their doctrine was also the belief that humans are not culpable for their sins, that these arise from the power of darkness residing in our flesh, and not as a failure of our will. It is important to note that both René Descartes and St. Augustine received a liberal education, an education we know to be truly befitting the free person. Yet, St. Augustine recognizes that it is due to the insights and gifts of discernment he gained through his liberal education that he is ultimately able to be liberated from the Manichaean falsehood. After 9 years in their congregation, Augustine is met with Faustus, a reputed guru of the Manichaean doctrine. And he is eager to put to him all of his philosophical questions, hoping that this guru can talk with him on a philosophical level. But he is quickly disappointed as he discovers that Faustus is not a learned man. Additionally, Augustine discovers that the whole basis of the Manichaean religion, their understanding of astronomy, is incongruent with the teachings of the ancients, with mathematical calculations, and with what we observe ourselves from the stars. He says, quote, I was commanded to believe the doctrine of the Manichees, yet it did not harmonize with the principles I had arrived at by mathematics and indeed by my own eyes, end quote. Augustine discovers that the Manichees are superficial, as is Faustus. They have no concern with whether or not their teachings harmonize with experienced reality. He leaves the congregation, but the influence of the Manichees still lingers in the periphery of his mind and imagination. Augustine struggles to break free of a carnal imagination. He struggles to understand God's immaterial nature, because for Augustine, believing and knowing are intrinsically tied to seeing and imagining. He wants to see God's nature as clearly as he sees 7 + 3 = 10, or as confidently as he knows that he himself exists. He has a Cartesian understanding of truth as something that must be clear and distinct in our own minds and satisfy our internal desires and standards. Furthermore, Augustine still does not believe that he is culpable for his actions. He seeks a truth that he can apprehend without having to change his licentious lifestyle. After he leaves the Manichees, however, Augustine does not know where to go, whom to turn to for truth. This limbo of doubt nearly drives him to despair, and it is in this time, in his dark and tormented soul, that he falls in with the thought of the skeptics, an old school of philosophers who taught that actually humans can't perceive truth, and everything is a matter of doubt. Augustine says, describing this time of his life, quote, I was gross of mind, not seeing even myself clearly, end quote. Thankfully, however, it is at this juncture that St. Augustine meets the Bishop of Milan, St. Ambrose, and his path to enlightenment and conversion intensifies. In his pursuit of truth, Augustine must surrender the preconceptions that hold him back and become reunified in his life as a composite being, reunified as body and soul. For Augustine, this means he must come to a meaningful intellectual conversion. He must come to a more full and true understanding of the nature of reality. And for him, this means understanding that God is immaterial, that God is not bound by the limits of the flesh. He must also reject the Cartesian ideal of certitude, that truth is something that satisfies our internal prescriptions for clarity and distinctness. But he must not go so far in the opposite direction as to assert with the skeptics that everything is a matter of doubt and the world is dark in front of our intellects. Augustine must find a middle ground, a more moderate path. He also requires a conversion of the heart, a moral conversion. This means if he perceives a truth with his mind, he must live accordingly with his body. He must reconcile the reality of his mind with the reality of his body and stop living as this disjuncted creature who searches for truth with his mind, but falls into licentiousness with his flesh. For Augustine specifically, this means he must overcome the sexual appetite that he is servile to, the sexual appetite that has thwarted his love of wisdom and his true human freedom. The conversion of Augustine comes about not through intellectual isolation like Descartes, but through collaboration with the influences of his friends and St. Ambrose and the Platonists. St. Ambrose shows St. Augustine that the Catholic faith has genuine arguments for the tenets of her doctrine, that the Catholics do not hold their beliefs in a vacuum, unharmonious with reality, like the Manichees, but that a real and meaningful relationship exists between their reason and their faith. He says, quote, "I began to see that the Catholic faith, for which I had thought nothing could be said in the face of the Manichean objections, could be maintained on reasonable grounds. This, especially after I had heard explained figuratively several passages of the Old Testament which had caused death for me when taken literally." End quote. St. Ambrose does for St. Augustine what good teachers do for us. He pulled him out of the obscurity of himself to reason in the daylight of intellectual community and objective reality. The Platonists further help St. Augustine to contemplate God's immaterial nature, bringing him to a cohesive metaphysics in which he can understand the relation of corporeal creation to the incorporeal creator. Augustine says, quote, "In them, the Platonists, I found, though not in the very words, the thing itself, which proved by all sorts of reasons that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word is the true light, which enlightens every man that comes into the world." End quote. These two realizations help St. Augustine see that remote intellectual knowledge is not enough, that to seek the merely satisfactory is to seek a phantom of the real magnitude and profundity of truth. He says, quote, "Your words, Lord, had rooted deep in my heart, and I was fenced about on all sides by you. Of your light I was now certain, though I saw it in a dark manner and through a glass. All my former doubt was taken from me." End quote. Now, while Descartes may think of such a mode of knowing as merely probable, St. Augustine recognizes that this is the truly proper mode of human knowing. Augustine's conversion and transformation of the heart comes through the stories that he's told by his friends of saints and converts, some of whom he knew himself personally. For example, he hears the story of two young couples who convert upon hearing the story themselves of St. Anthony. Additionally, he hears the story of someone he had known during his days as a professional rhetorician who bravely converted publicly to the Catholic faith. When he is in the garden of his conversion, praying before the Lord, Augustine hears the words sung by little children, "Take and read." He interprets this as a message meant for him and does exactly that. He takes and reads the New Testament, and his eyes immediately fall upon this passage. Quote, "Put ye on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make not provision for concupiscences of the flesh." End quote. the Word of God reveals to St. Augustine that the enlightenment of a human is the enlightenment of a composite being. That enlightenment means the reconciliation of our mind and our body and living as a unified hylomorphic unity. St. Augustine says, quote, "The inner man knows these things through the ministry of the outer man," end quote. We are both the inner and the outer man. It is not merely in thinking that we exist. It is in being a body unified with a soul. Furthermore, it shows St. Augustine that truth is not just a label we put on a subjective experience. Truth is the act of conforming ourselves to objective reality, or truth inheres in conforming ourselves to objective reality. As we conclude, I would like to return to the two images with which we began, the image from Delphi and the revolutionary image presented to us by modernity. Descartes, like Kant, holds that enlightenment is the liberation and complete sovereignty of the individual intellect over nature and objective reality. But this is not real freedom. This is Luciferian autonomy, the idea that objective reality exists for us to impose our own will upon it. Adjacent to this is the idea that truth is oblique to the human experience, that it is not accessible to us through our composite nature, that we are created with a nature not fully conducive to our end. If our end is to perceive truth, then, and that's just the act of the intellect, then why do we have a body? And more so, why would we have a body with senses that try to lie to us? In contrast, St. Augustine suggests that enlightenment is in reconciling with our nature. It is in living as a unified body and soul. And that truth is something we must conform ourselves to. That in aligning ourselves with objective reality, we can find the true human freedom that we are meant for. C.S. Lewis, in his essay, The Abolition of Man, describes the dichotomy that exists between modern ideas of enlightenment and ancient ideas. He says, quote, "For the wise men of old, the cardinal problem had been how to conform the soul to reality. For magic and applied science alike, modernity, the problem is how to subdue reality to the wishes of men," end quote. Furthermore, St. John Paul II, in his encyclical Veritatis Splendor, beautifully describes the relationship between truth and human freedom. He says, quote, "Truth enlightens man's intelligence and shapes his freedom, leading him to know and to love the Lord," end quote. As we ponder these, I would like to end with one more quote from C.S. Lewis, I can't help myself, from The Abolition of Man, in which he describes the terminus of this idea that freedom is in overcoming objective reality. He says, quote, "You cannot go on seeing through things forever. The whole point of seeing through something is to see something through it. It is no use trying to see through first principles. If you see through everything, then everything is transparent. But a wholly transparent world is an invisible world. To see through all things is the same as not to see," end quote. If we seek freedom from first principles, from objective reality, we end up blind and servile. But if we align ourselves with objective reality, if we truly seek truth, we discover our freedom and how to become what we are meant to be, enlightened. Thank you.
Thank you, Bren. We'll start with a few questions from the panel and then open it up to the audience as well.
I defer to my supposed equal. Really superior.
Descartes would say you're equal, yes.
Thank you, Bren. I have a question about Luciferian autonomy. I'm not quite sure I understand it. That is, what's wrong with subduing reality to the wishes of men?
Mm.
So, like, I mean, sometimes I do in fact wash the dinner dishes. And is that an example of subduing reality to the wishes of men? Would it be better to simply conform my intellect to reality and say, yes, the dishes are dirty?
Sorry, what was the last
I'm
part?
trying to understand what's wrong with subduing reality to the wishes of men. I mean, don't we do that all the time? Everything we do, pretty much.
We are beings that are meant to like interact with the world.
Yeah.
And God made us as stewards of creation, which means that we do have meaningful duty to interact with the world. But I think the idea of Luciferian autonomy that I'm trying to express is the idea that freedom means going against nature in a way that is unnatural. Let me explain that. That freedom is in license. It's in conforming external reality to fit some internal principle and not something that's in the nature of reality itself. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure. I mean, to the extent that you want to conform, make it conform, it's because there is something that is currently not in the nature of reality that you would like to be in the nature of reality, right?
Like you would like it to be in the nature of
Yeah.
reality?
That's what I meant, right? I would like the dishes to be clean, but they're not.
Mm-hmm. But they should be.
Right, exactly.
Because that is the nature of reality that, let me think about this and to try to understand it in a way. Doing the dishes is different than asserting that you are just an intellect when experienced reality clearly shows otherwise, that you're not a disembodied intellect floating in the void. You are, in fact, Dr. Bolin with a body and a mind. And doing the dishes is different because it's in the nature of the dishes to need to be clean. Does that make sense?
Meaning it's good for them to be or something like that?
Yes, yeah. It's part of what is good for the dishes and what is good for you as a steward of creation to clean the dishes.
Okay, I like that. But then I don't quite understand why would one describe the problem in terms of conforming the intellect to reality or the other ground instead of the problem of determining what is good?
Oh, I think can you say that again?
I like that, right? But because of course, if you take mundane examples like that's obvious that we should and need to make reality conform to our wishes all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But then I wonder, why are we describing the problem in terms of one conformity versus the other instead of just the problem of determining what is good to do?
I think because in modernity, there's this implicit understanding that it is actually good for us to be the arbiters of reality, that our good is in being free in this way, and being autonomous and determining the meaning of the external world as it relates to us. And that is in fact not our good. We learned through external reality what our good is and what we ought to be as human people. So
the critique really is of a view of freedom, which is mistaken about what is good.
Yeah, because we are humans. We are meant to be free, but our idea of freedom is informed by what we believe our ultimate good is. Mm-hmm.
Okay, that will do for now.
Thank you, Dr. Bren.
One short follow-up on Dr. Boland's line of questioning. Regarding the last quote from Lewis, there's no use trying to see through first principles. Wouldn't Descartes say in his own defense, precisely what I'm trying to do is find adequate first principles? He doesn't understand his own project as seeing through first principles in the way that the authors of the Green Book do, that Lewis is attacking. So in other words, wouldn't Descartes say, there's actually a difference between me and Raskolnikov, or between me and the positivists of the 20th century, or between me and the postmoderns?
I think he would say that, yes. And in a sense, the principles he goes off of to build his method, some of them aren't that crazy. Like, we know Socrates uses doubt as a path to certitude, and it's something that I think we all do with our intellects. But I think the problem with Descartes and his principles is that he is simultaneously asserting that we cannot rely on external input as sources of truth. And also asserting these axioms that seem to come from, that you can only really get from external input, like the idea that all people are equally capable of discerning true from false. Where did he get that? That itself seems kind of in opposition with this idea that the external world is not a meaningful source of truth for us. So I think he recognizes the necessity of first principles in any well-ordered system. But the way he arrives at his is through disregarding the first principles that nature itself gives us, that are right before us, and asserting this idea that actually what we're supposed to do is go against what is natural to us. Yeah.
Can I interject something? Am I wrong in reading that passage from Descartes as him mostly being sarcastic? I mean, I think you mentioned this actually, but the part that's elided there in the ellipsis.
The first sentence of the
Right, the good sense is equal, that is the best distributed thing. You're right, he doesn't even say, because I've never met anyone who was willing to admit they had less than anyone else.
Yeah,
Which feels to
does
me
say
like he's
that.
being sarcastic.
Well, I think quite possibly it's a little tongue-in-cheek. However, this principle is the basis for his idea that error is something that exists in the objects we consider, in the methods of our thinking, and not in the thinker itself. That error is in the external world, that it's not in the act of the intellect. So even if it's a little sarcastic, I think that there is actually a really interesting thing that comes out of that he needs. He needs that idea that error is, in the senses, not in my act of thinking. And that is necessary for him to build his system.
You mentioned Socrates,
Yes.
so I want to go there.
Okay.
I'm not going to dispute the idea that Augustine is, in some fundamental sense, an ancient thinker. I think that's fine, but nevertheless, the most natural person to think of when you make an ancient modern dichotomy would be Socrates as opposed to Descartes. And there's one of the things that Socrates positively claims to know is about erotic things. He says, I know about the things pertaining to Eros, and just makes that claim alongside, I know that I don't know, and so on. He clearly claims to know some things. I wonder if that's actually part of the key to the distinction you're drawing here. So really, I want to know about Eros and Thumos, because you mentioned evolution of man, that's all about Thumos, but just to stick with Eros, to the extent that it appeared in your oration, it was in the negative form of license in Augustine's biography. But is there, this is maybe a pretty leading question, but I'm wondering if there is for Augustine, as there very clearly is for Socrates, a positive form of Eros in the philosophic life, and if the problem with Descartes' philosophy is that it's not erotic enough.
Eros.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that question. Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong, but in the Symposium, Socrates talks about Eros as being like the ladder that leads us to the good, to perceive the truth. Like starting with seeing
The
beautiful things.
This is the other transcendental.
The other truth.
But
Yes,
yes,
the beautiful. Yeah, when we see a beautiful thing, it draws us into its goodness. For Augustine, he says, while he's talking about this time in his life where he's very licentious, he says that his desire was to love and to be loved, but he didn't really understand what that looked like in a meaningful way, apart from just indulging his sexual appetite. But he does recognize in his book, The Confessions, that our natural inclinations, our nature gives us inclinations toward the good. That this desire to have a sexual relationship with somebody is actually a desire for love. That's what Eros does. It leads us to the good and the beautiful. But we need to control that with our intellect. It can't just be running wild, because then we're actually not obtaining the thing that we desire, the real good that we desire. And yeah, I think I might have lost my train of thought.
Well, just the other part of it is, so you sort of noted maybe there's a kind of presence of Eros in the elevated form as well in Augustine. wanting to love and be loved, that can take this sort of higher form of loving and be loved by God, loving and being loved properly. Would you say that there's an absence of this in Descartes, or that was the other half of what I was wondering about?
Yes.
Yeah.
I
So
would.
where would you see the absence?
Yeah.
That makes sense.
I think it's in the fact that he just does a really weird thing. His idea of human nature is that we're a disembodied intellect, and that meaning resides in like the system that we can logically delineate, not in, I guess I understand Eros as having a meaningful relationship with the body and with our appetites and inclinations toward things that are good and beautiful. But for him, what's satisfying is something that he can look at, a logical system that he can look at and behold in the entirety of its pieces. And enlightenment or truth is something that lies at the end of this system, not something that our natural inclinations can lead us to. In fact, our natural inclinations probably get us off the right path.
Good, thank you, Bren. I'm wondering if you could say some more on the nature of freedom, sort of
Yes.
expand on that a little bit. It seems like, at least in one sense, being free is being liberated from various constraints that are imposed on you. Whereas what it seems like you're describing is a freedom that is a conformity to a good that's maybe outside of myself. I'm wondering about that seeming paradox. If you're conforming to something that's outside of you, isn't that a kind of servitude, which feels like the opposite of freedom? Wouldn't I be more free if I could just determine the good for myself? You know, like Adam and Eve did, right?
Yeah, I think there are two different ideas of freedom that we talked about. The autonomous freedom of complete freedom of choice, and this freedom of conforming to objective reality, which I like to think about it as freedom of being in right relation. When we are in right relation with as a composite being and with our nature, and in right relation to our final end, it actually enables us to be more human, to be what we're supposed to be. And this other kind of freedom of choice is something that wants to completely ignore the natural limits that we have. I think Aristotle talks about this either in De Anima or Metaphysics, where he talks about nature is that which gives us limitations, right? Because it's the form and the matter. But this freedom of autonomy almost wants to ignore that we need any sort of limitation or any sort of form. But without those things, you're not a real thing. You're not a real being within nature. You need limits, and these are what give you the ability to do anything meaningful. And this autonomy, freedom of autonomy, actually, I find in a lot of modern philosophy ends up just being servile to something else, often our desires or our whims or our passions or our ideologies. Whereas this freedom of being in conformity to objective reality or being in right relation gives us the ability to be well-rounded individuals. Does that answer?
Yes, thank you.
Clara Ramsey is giving a wonderful oration on this, so I recommend.
We'll open it up to questions from the audience as well.
Okay. So you explained, thank you, that was awesome. You explained exactly how Augustine was enslaved by his false philosophy, and that it led to just being like totally kind of like out of control when it came to his desires and passions. Can you explain a little bit how Descartes ended up enslaved? Like I'm a little, I don't see exactly that progression. That like his philosophy led to some enslavement and like knowledge true freedom for him.
Mm-hmm. I think for Descartes, the thing that he was enslaved to is this idea that truth is something that has to satisfy our internal prescriptions of clarity and distinctness, that something is not warranting belief unless we can see it clearly in our mind. And for him, this meant that nothing in the external world, no human society, no tradition, and not even his own senses could teach him anything meaningful about reality and about himself. And the only thing that could teach him about reality was this idea of truth as clear and distinct. But most things that we experience in life aren't clear and distinct that way. So I'm not sure if that really answers your question, but when we're servile to this specific prescription for truth, we actually miss the beauty of the world in front of us and the meaning of human connection, and the meaning of what it means to be a unity of body and soul. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yes, Claudia.
Thank you for your consideration, Bren. I had a question. You spent a good deal of time talking about sort of the biographical details of Augustine and Descartes. And you pointed out especially how in Augustine's life, he names the specific friends that sort of shape the coming, his coming into an understanding of freedom in this light as subordinated to the good. Whereas in Descartes' life, and when he recounted in Discourse on Method, he never really mentions any sort of friendships. In fact, we get the image of Descartes sitting on his stove.
He has no friends.
In his room for 3 months, working out this new philosophy.
Yes.
And I was wondering, maybe if you could comment for a moment on the importance of sort of the proximate community in
Like the common good.
his coming into the understanding of freedom in the way that you're proposing is correct. I don't know if you
Okay, wait, sorry. Commenting on the proximate.
or the fact that Augustine is willing to enter into relationships and friendships, right? And then he, in reflecting on his life, realizes that it was through those friendships that he was able, and the stories that those friends told him, that he came to this understanding and kind of worked through his problems. Whereas Descartes doesn't have that. In some ways, he just goes into his little attic room, sits on the stove.
He does, yes. Augustine works with the resources that are in front of him and that are given to him naturally, like community and friends, and sees them as meaningful sources of knowledge. He sees Ambrose as someone he can actually learn from, and his other friends as people who search for truth and people he can admire because of that. And Descartes intentionally goes against the natural inclination to have friends. Maybe he thinks he's too cool. I don't know. And sorry, was there a second part of your question?
No, that was mainly.
Okay.
Yeah.
He thinks that his nature is or his natural inclinations are lying to him. I think deep down, and that friends are not, intellectual community is not meaningful and is actually distracting from the truth.
And I guess it seems like what you're almost saying is that intellectual bias then precludes the possibility of his conversion.
Yeah. And then, yes, of Descartes' conversion?
Yeah, like because he refuses to enter into conversation, he can't get out of this philosophical trap even.
Yeah. I don't want to be presumptuous because he said he was Catholic.
He's a baptized Catholic.
He's baptized Catholics. Catholic, yeah. And I don't want to be presumptuous, but I think he's denying his nature as a relational being. And actually, at the end of his discourses, he jumps from doing all this theoretical stuff to doing this like practical, subdue nature. We have to have really good medicine because that's the height of our intellectual inquiries. And it seems like that's kind of the extent of community for him, or the extent of a meaningful understanding of common good is like showing other people how to subdue nature.
Yeah, he specifically says, I need to write in order to contribute to the common good.
Yeah.
I would have a guilty conscience if I did not publish
Mhm.
this because it might be useful for medicine, which relieves others' suffering.
And prolongs life.
Is it right you had sort of framed at some point in this oration the contrast as humility, submission,
Mhm.
submission on the ancient part, as opposed to being revolutionary or something like that. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because the quote from Augustine on scripture, there's something, it's like too humble, and so it's off-putting to him at a certain point. It doesn't have the sense of the heroic, but is the way that you land in this dichotomy that the proper thing is to sort of submit to reality or to tradition and do the ancient thing, and that's what the ancient thing is, as opposed to this misbegotten notion of heroism and revolutionary disruption? Or is there a properly heroic,
Yes. Yeah.
assertive searching in Augustine, as opposed to
I
just,
think
well,
Augustine is a
here's the truth,
great
I need to submit to
example, actually, of how this submission and surrender is actually like a heroic thing to do. It's not like he's blindly following he does that for a while with the Manichees and is like, wow, this is really unsatisfying and I'm really sad and depressed and not a happy human. For him, he recognizes that like he does still have the duty to exercise his reason in a meaningful way, but that this has to be in right relation. This surrender is surrendering to objective reality by being as we're meant to be and not just asserting one part of ourselves as more important than the other. And I think the revolutionaries boil human nature down to like one aspect, like, yes, we're supposed to be free, or yes, we have an intellect, so we're supposed to be really smart and just intellectual. And they're like getting it wrong because they're missing the whole picture. And this surrender that Augustine discovers is heroic because it brings him into a more full mode of being, a more able mode of being. Does that make sense? I think it is humility, but I did not use that word. Yeah. Anyone else? Teresa.
I was wondering if I'm recalling Descartes' discourse properly. It seemed like he starts with like a sort of exaltation of the intellect, as you were saying, and then in the later part, he gets very scientific, showing how it's useful. And it seems almost like at the end, like he says the best thing you can do for mankind and for like intelligence and happiness is to improve medicine because we depend so much on our bodily health to like function, which seems really strange. It seems like at the beginning he's like exalting the intellect, and in the end he actually subjects it in, I don't know, a more servile way to the body and sort of makes the body's needs primary. I don't know if you had thoughts on that, if you looked into that in your thesis.
Yes, it is. It's like he does this really weird 180, right? Where first he's asserting that the intellect is the highest thing, and then seems to subject it servilely to the body, like you said. The way I understand that is that at the very end of writing the discourses, he himself is being confronted with the implications of Gnosticism, which is this idea that he holds that the intellect is separate from the body, that truth exists in the intellect. But his realization of that, his realization, I think, therefore I am, doesn't like magically cause him to ascend out of his body and just exist as a disembodied intellect in the void. Like he actually has to continue to live as this body, soul, divided, contrasting being. So the way I've understood it is that he does that because he has to, because he can't just ignore the physical aspects of the human being, and he's realizing that. But he doesn't want to say that his entire method has been useless. So he makes the assertion at the end that my speculative philosophy, my theoretical work pleases me, but everyone else may have their own theoretical philosophy that pleases them, and there's no way that I could really convince them that mine is right. So they can have that and I can have mine. But what's left for us? Well, the science, like the physical sciences. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, good. Marietta.
I just wondered if you had some thoughts on Saint Augustine, kind of because of his like whole journey of conversion as an intellectual guide, I guess, for I don't know those of us who also are trying to figure out what it means to be enlightened. I guess I wondered if you had any specific things about Augustine's view of truth that you found yourself sort of leaning on as you think about true things. Obviously, Descartes has a lot of his own principles that he works off of in his search for truth. And I was wondering if you had found any sort of anything you could call principles of St. Augustine's search for truth that we could lean on in ours.
That's a really interesting question. I would not say you should model your life off of St. Augustine's, first of all. That sounds like a bad idea. I don't know if I would have to think about that, about if there are specific like principles, because what Augustine is doing in the Confessions is not like setting up a system for arriving at truth. He's giving a testimony of the nature of truth and the nature of all of us in relation to that truth, in relation to God. But I was thinking about your oration and how humans are relational, conversational beings. And one just quote that I think about often that from St. Augustine that I find helpful to meditate on to further understand his understanding of enlightenment is on the board that he says, "What I know of myself, I know through God's light," or he actually says through the shining of God's light. What we know of ourselves, we know only in relation to our Creator, and only through what God tells us, and thus through the nature He gives us. So I know that's maybe not quite what you were looking for, but
We have time for one more question.
oh no.
I just wanted to piggyback on that.
Yes.
And there seem to be actually several features in the way you presented his biography
Mhm.
that we keep coming back to. He's in contrast to Descartes, that he's encountering other people,
Mhm.
whether those are good teachers or bad teachers, right? Ambrose or
Mhm.
Faustus, and sort of being able to judge between them in some way. Even like the use of like he studied astronomy and then he knows that the Manichees don't know what they're talking about. It's like that's
Yeah.
and that somehow indirectly like the use of that liberal art that doesn't directly have something to do with God. It's like ultimately because it's about the truth and he can sort of test and claim. So it seems like through conversation and also through story.
Absolutely.
There was the moment where you're talking about the conversion of the heart of his friends and reading the story, converts, and then reading about St. Anthony. It seemed like you might wind up saying something about conversation, about encountering real people, but then also about like reading stories as being actually a mode of enlightenment or movement towards enlightenment.
He's the best advocate for the humanities track. Yeah.
but not to the exclusion of like the quadrivial arts.
Yes.
It's also you also need to know your astronomy in order to call out the false teachings when you encounter them. Maybe for instance.
Yes. Yeah. The idea that our social nature is not, it's actually given to us to help bring us to truth, not something that we have to fight against. We can and should learn from our friends and our teachers.
Thank you, Bren.
Thank you.